Welcome back to Animal Crossing New Horizons. I'm dear darling, as you see what's going on a lovely island of Fawnhollow today, where if you can tell by today's title, we are going to be talking about Omori here. And okay, just a forewarning, if you know, this is not going to be me recreating anything in Omori. If you're new to this channel, this is my daily vlog. I've literally just finished playing Omori and I'm going to talk about it. So yeah, I'll warn you before I get into any spoilers. And you might be like, whoa, you talked about Cuphead yesterday, you're talking about Omori today? Yeah, I basically popped off yesterday and got, like, I had to keep playing Omori because I had to see what was going on, had to see how it ended. Today, this episode of, like, review discussion is also going to be a little bit different because I'm not going to do, like, drip-wise spoilerisms. I'm going to go basically from my general thing straight into complete deep spoilers. So if you want to if you haven't played a game, basically stop watching this video. Go watch any other video, I don't mind. I'm not going to take a personal offense or anything. Please don't watch this video if you haven't played Omori, okay? Anyway, hello everyone. Right now in Fawnhollow at 6:02 PM on Friday, February 10th, 2023. So this might actually be a bit of a longer episode than usual, but my general non-spoiler, I suppose, review would be I liked it, and in fact I would say I loved it. It's a fantastic game. I will say that in the Let's Play, I think I'm a little bit tired, I think, especially towards the final couple of episodes, because I was recording it at like 11 PM, which I was meant to stop at like 10, and then I just kept going because I was like, what's going on? There's no good place to stop. I have to find out what's going on. And then things like sort of like I didn't have enough time to process things entirely, I think, during everything. So I apologize if you go watch that video. I don't know if it was not going to be out literally for like another month or so, but when you go watch that video, I apologize if it sounds a bit more negative than what I usually sound like of that sort of thing, because I was just kind of like tired, and like it was a lot happened, I suppose, in the game, and it was a lot for me to process. Okay, so continuing with the non-spoiler portion, I would basically give this game like a 9.5 out of 10. I would, there are parts of the game where I'm just like, this is absolutely perfect for me. And genuinely, while I was playing this game, I was like, I wonder if this is going to be like my perfect game, because it started to veer in that direction, but you know, it didn't quite nail it it didn't quite nail everything perfectly for me personally, but it was still great enough to get a 9.5 out of 10, and that is quite a high rating for me, because if you don't know, I like to use a full scale range of the rating scale. I use from 1 to 10, so that sort of thing. So anything above 9 is already incredible for my personal tastes, I would say. I don't give objective, or everything I say in this video is going to be completely subjective, because I'm doing it for my review. I'm not a professional video game reviewer or anything like that. I don't need to consider the masses or anything like that. I'm just going to say my own personal thoughts and that sort of thing. So you might completely disagree, totally fine. That's just how life is. But yeah, and I also just want to preface that I tend to be quite critical, especially of games that I like a lot. So any game like in the 1 to 7 category, I'm just like, yeah, it is what it is. Maybe not exactly perfect, but that's just like kind of it. But then like any game from like 9 and above, I tend to be really harshly critical, because I'm just like, it's so close to perfection for me that these are the small little things where I wish just tweaked a little bit for like that perfect image in my mind. I also made like a little notepad for me because I had to get my thoughts down to think about what I wanted to talk about. So yeah, let's see if I just covered everything. Okay, now here is your final spoiler warning. Everything from now on has potential to spoil literally any aspect of a game. So that is your final warning. If you've not played a game, if you don't want to be spoiled about the game or anything, and I urge you, if you haven't played a game, to stop watching. Stop watching. There's all bars are off for spoilers from here on out in Omori. Okay, so yeah, one thing I just wanted to preface is I probably related most to Mari, is why I ended up, basically, in the Let's Play, I sound a little bit negative towards the ending and the revelation of the ending, and it's because I've now had more time to think about it. And I pinpointed it basically to it hinging on something which I couldn't suspend my disbelief enough for, and the fact that I think I probably related to Mari the most, so it felt like a weird sort of twist on, like, not maybe like a betrayal of her character, but not really a betrayal of her character. I would say in the universe, I think the story feels reasonable enough, I would say. And that ending, all of it up to that ending, perfectly fine. And just the ending is just like a bit, okay, like I'm therefore right. But I always like to take a look at these sort of media properties from a step backwards, where from a story writing perspective, or from like a game design perspective in that sense, because when you create these games, you control every aspect of this game. So every choice you make in the game has to have reason, has to have some sort of meaning behind it. Even if it's a simple meaning, that there was a conscious choice for that decision to be in the game. So that's why, you know, I would tend to have like two opinions on things. I will say this game, was very emotional, I would say, and it genuinely did subvert me, I will say, towards the ending. Like, it's weird that I'm talking about the ending first, but it was definitely, I guess we'll go back to the ending. Let's talk about like good things and some bad things about the game. So good things, the characters are fantastic in the game. Most of the characters, I will say, of the main cast, of the important characters, get a good amount of development. Obviously, Sunny gets a lot of development, Aubrey and Kel and Hero get reasonable amounts of development as well. Mary basically gets like no development, but you know, she's dead, so I guess that's kind of why. And Basil doesn't really get as much development as I would have liked, to be perfectly honest. It's the sort of thing, but because I love the concept of Omori's real world, dream world, escape fantasy thing, but the thing is that those characters kind of are like two different characters. I know they are intertwined with each other, but the real characters are the one, and the real world actually in the entirety of the Omori game was the part I love the most. I love the real world setting, and the dream world setting was a cool, like, fun time, I suppose, afterwards. Part of me wishes there was more time in the real world and more time to explore some of the characters. I would love to have seen more, like, anything for like flashbacks more about Mary, just to know more about her, I suppose, because you only get really like sort of passing glances, and the dream world is not very representative. It's kind of representative of her, but it's of course for a faulty narrator. What's the word? Something narrator, like a untrustworthy narrator. And Basil basically gets like no like screen time like whatsoever, so everything I think of his character sort of landed a little bit flatter than it could have for me, but honestly the game has fantastic foreshadowing and storytelling, whereas now a lot of times I'm looking back at the story and being like wow, especially after looking at other people post secrets and being like wow, this puts things in a whole new light, looking at seeing like what was foreshadowed and what wasn't. And a great thing that this game actually does is a sort of double twist, is kind of how I'd put it, like a fake out twist, because you play this game and I at least knew that this game wasn't everything that it seems. I knew it had horror elements to it, but you play the game and it looks very comfy, it looks very cozy and everything, but then you start to get the feeling of something wrong in the real world. And I think if you are reasonably astute, you don't have to be the most astute person when, you'll probably get the implication that yes, Mary is dead, and you'll probably at least garner the suspicion that maybe she took her own life, which is why it's like so, like, you know, you're expecting this to be a big fake out, and you expect this basically to be an entire game about grief and moving on from a loss of a loved one and from like an unexpected death, I suppose, in that way. And it turns out the game is about that, kind of, but it's not so much the focus on, I suppose, the loss of a loved one as it is so much on the focus of a catharsis of releasing not just grief, but like a burden, I suppose, from the main character, I suppose, in particular, because as it turns out, you know, the biggest spoilers of all, Mary did not take her own life, at least intentionally. She was accidentally killed, or manslaughtered, I suppose, by Sunny, the main character, and then it was framed to be her taking her own life, because that's, I don't know, like, that's what happened. We'll get on to more of that in later. And it's fantastic foreshadowing because it drops enough hints for you to pick up on the her taking her own life, but it does drop also things that you see in retrospect, being like, oh, this is why it's like so like bad, because you can tell throughout the let's play. I'm just like, okay, I'm really surprised that they spoiled, quote quote, that Mary took her own life so early on into the thing. It happened like literally on the first like real world day, or maybe the second real world day, whenever you first meet Aubrey. And I was like, whoa, this is like a really early spoiler. So I'm like, I wonder what, like, it felt like it was leading up to a big twist, but I was like, I thought that was going to be the twist, so maybe there isn't a twist at all. But then it turns out the twist, of course, being the accidental murder. There's a lot of things which I feel like drip drop little hints back and forth, like, namely the big one, it was being like, Basil seems to have some major secret, which I just, like, could not figure out. Like, I had no idea what was going on with that. I'm not sure if I said it in the Let's Play as much, but part of me did have an inclination of being like, I wonder if Basil somehow caused Mary taking her own life. I thought that's what it was leading up to, and it basically sort of subverted that entirely, and it was like, no, it was Omori who did it, and she didn't even take her own life in the first place. It was just a pure accident. It was just a pure tragic event, and I suppose that's really sort of like the underlying theme of the story, is it's just a complete tragic event, which shouldn't have happened to anyone, and you would never wish it upon anyone, but it happened, and it's about accepting it and moving on and being able to understand that things may not be the same. Things have changed, and understanding that it doesn't mean that things have to stop though. So yeah, I think it does a fantastic job at storytelling. It does a great job at making really charming and engaging characters, and it ties things together pretty well, I would say. Like, basically all of it, I would say, is tied together really well, except for the linchpin of, as I'll get onto, like, the actual truth feels a bit iffy for my own personal taste, but not because of the like sadness of it, but because of the way I suppose it was tied together. I might just like chill in Town Square just so I can talk about this. So the juxtaposition between the fun world and horror was really cool, and it was really like nice. It does kind of feel like you're playing two games sometimes, I will say, because it goes pretty far on, but not pretty far on both. No, maybe it does go pretty far on both extremes. So you're just sort of like, what is going on? But I feel like it's sort of like an indie RPG sort of classic to have very strong like horror elements in a certain degree. But I feel like Omori does it really well because it does horror and creepiness through tension, which I love so much more than like jump scares, because a lot of other like horror things, they do like creeping tension, but you know something's going to jump scare, boom, jump scare, release. But Omori doesn't really give you that sort of like release a lot of the times. A lot of the times it's just mounting tension, it's just creeping tension, then something scary happens, and then it's kind of like a release, but it's not a release. It's like a lack of catharsis, anything, where it just sort of like, that's it, you know. There wasn't like a big like scream or anything. It's just sort of like and then like it stops before anything comes to the end, which I suppose is meant to mirror the story in its own right? That it's like it's a build up, and then the main character Sunny has never given himself like the catharsis of a release or anything like that, so there is none. And there's very, very few jump scares in the game that I can think of, but there are a few, I will say. But I might have just done an amazing job at avoiding them, but the only one I can remember was the one at the end where Mary's like turns into like a demonic form and sort of like rushes out the screen a little bit, but I honestly kind of like blinked and mostly kind of missed it, so it didn't really get me. So I might be a bit biased in my skewness on there. I also think this game does a fantastic job at stoking discussion. Its ending, and I have seen its other endings now as well. I'm not sure if I've seen necessarily all the endings, but I think I've seen all of the endings. It stokes really good discussion because it leaves things reasonably open-ended, such that you can draw your own conclusions of it, and basically it allows people to discuss what they think the story is telling them and what lessons have they personally learned from it. And I feel like after reading a lot of other people's discussions, a lot of people have different takes and opinions on it, so, you know, I'll go into my own ones about that, but I think it really delves into an interesting one about how much can a person do and still deserve forgiveness. Will they still deserve forgiveness from other people, and how is that different from deserving forgiveness, I suppose, from yourself, and that sort of thing. And, you know, the burden of carrying a secret, like, and it's, you know, the toss-up, like locking away a secret versus telling people about it. It has a fantastic mix of happy and sad things. You know, like me, I love my melancholy, I love my bittersweet, and I think it does a happy and sadness very well. Its taste of sadness sometimes goes a bit weird, I would say, for my own personal taste. I like melancholy when it's like intermixed with each other, like, and betrayal that makes you sort of like heart hurt. But sometimes the sadness goes into a thing where it just makes you go like, ugh, which is fair enough. It's basically just like a different perspective of sadness, and it's not necessarily my favourite flavour of sadness, but I still like it quite a lot. And I think it does a really good job of portraying trauma. I would say it's very extreme trauma, but I'm not going to say that people don't suffer from this sort of trauma or don't relate to that trauma necessarily, because, and I think the long and short of it is, all of those kids need to go to therapy like 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, whenever it first happened. But they needed to have been in therapy because they clearly haven't been. It's just a general tragic situation, and the subversion of reveal is one that legitimately got me. I didn't actually see that ending coming, and I actually do like, taking a step back, I like the grand scheme idea of a reveal of a plot. I love, like, you know, I love the fact that they baited you into thinking, Mary taking her own life, that's the main plot twist. Psych, we told you it like immediately, there is no plot twist. Psych, the actual plot twist is that it was caused accidentally by Sunny, the main character, and then it was framed as her taking her own life. I love that grand scale like idea. I don't love the execution of it in its entirety, but I love the idea of it, and it makes for such a heart-wrenching story, I suppose, at the end. It's really, really tragic, basically, because it's the thing where it's just like, everyone did a little bit wrong, I suppose, is how I describe it. No one did anything like crazy, massive, well, in theory, no one did anything crazy, massively wrong, but it's just all the little things adding up led to a really tragic event. So like, I'm pained from it. Everyone messed up a little bit, so, you know, that made it a bit more interesting. And I like how it talks about basically a good person doing a bad thing, like one really, really bad thing, and the trauma and the pain that comes from it, and the sort of like the wish that the pain of wishing that you could take it back in any way, but knowing you never can, is really a fantastic not motivational, but fantastically powerful emotional story. It's also got an interesting commentary on self-forgiveness rather than just grief and moving on, because I think the game really sets itself up to look like it's about moving on, it's about coping with loss, it's about coping with grief, but really it's actually a story, to me, about self-forgiveness, about being able to move on, but not from sadness, but from regret, from guilt, I suppose, in that sense, which was interesting, because I was like, I don't think I've seen many games which talk about that. Loss is a very common thing to talk about, of course, in games and media property in general, but, self-regret and guilt, I suppose, are that sort of thing, because people don't tend to like portraying a protagonist as, not evil necessarily, but in the wrong, I suppose, in that sense. So it's really interesting, it's seeing it being about catharsis rather than acceptance, especially with the focus on the end. The focus is very much on Sunny releasing the burden rather than whether his friends will accept the story or not, accept the truth or not, or forgive him, because that's not what it's about. It's about him being able to let go and saying, no matter what happens, now I can move forward. No matter, things won't be the same. It doesn't matter if my friends accept or my apology or accept that things are different or forgive me. They deserve to know the truth, that sort of thing. So yeah, those are my main points I've written down as good things. The bad things, I think, it basically entirely hinges on the fact that I could not suspend my disbelief enough for me to completely invest into the setup, the linchpin, which it all relies on, is that it was a framed taking of your own life. I'm dancing kind of around the words because I don't want YouTube to flag me filter-wise and get this video marked mature. So it's ending itself, not the end result, but the method is strange, I think, from out the universe. Take a step back. You're not in the game, you're not in the characters, you're not thinking from their perspective, you're taking it from a writing perspective. It's a really convoluted way, I think, to set up that narrative. To me personally, you have to sort of buy into a lot of suspense of disbelief. Okay. Firstly, I think a thing which is not done as well is Mary isn't given enough time in the real world to see the development. So I got kind of blindsided with the fact that she was I understood that she liked things to be done right, but I didn't think she was that much of a chronic perfectionist, so much so that she would not belittle, I suppose, but be put under stress so much that she as I understand from the bonus text, I suppose, from the Black Space photo album, that she scoffs at Sunny, being why can't you just do this perfectly? In that sense, and how sort of pernickety, I suppose, she was about that sort of thing. I really would have liked to see that more in the story. I could just be incredibly dense and I might have just missed it, or because I played it over 4 months or something, I probably forgot a lot of the details. That's fair enough, but that just explains my reaction. And then I totally buy into Sunny pushing Mary down the stairs, not on purpose, just in a fit of rage, just be get out my way sort of thing, I wish that there was something a bit more clear, that she was sort of just blocking the way to the stairways, being hey, we're having an argument, I'm not done here, you can't just run away. And then Omori, Sunny just being get out my way, that sort of thing, and pushing her. Because I didn't get that. I thought they were just having a fight and then he threw her down the stairs and I was like, what? that's insane. Why would he do that? Is he a psychopath or something? But seeing it reframed as a complete accident, spur of a moment sort of thing, not thinking through what you're doing at all, really sells it more to me. Her falling down the stairs and then instantly dying it's not implausible, I would say. It's definitely possible. People have definitely perished from a lot less, but it feels a lot to buy into. It's a lot to buy into for me personally, to be okay, she fell down. It's even the longest flight of stairs, generally young people will be kind of okay, because you kind of have a natural reaction to sort of protect your head as you fall down something. I get that she was taken off guard, I get she was probably off balance and that sort of thing, and it is very possible that she just immediately slammed her head onto the corner of a stair or something, and then was perished instantly. That I'd say is plausible, but it's sort of just I feel there might have been a neater way to do it, but I'm still willing enough to buy into that sort of thing. But and then the moment where Sunny and Basil are freaking, or Sunny Mania, I suppose, is freaking out and it being I think, why is it dream? Why wouldn't you wake up? And moving her and that sort of thing, despite that obviously not being what you should do in an emergent situation, I think it's reasonably believable. I am a bit surprised though that it never was let's call an ambulance or something, because maybe it's just a different upbringing, but it's so drilled into you, I suppose, when I was younger, that it was this is the emergency services, there's certain rules stranger danger and emergency services or something, or getting help from an adult, they're so drilled into me through school and that sort of thing, that it's sort of surprising to me that wasn't what they ended up doing. which is fair, I guess. Like later on, as you'll see, that, and this is a part which I just can't buy into anymore, where Basil comes, as I understand it, comes up with the idea to frame it as her taking her own life, and then them executing it. Like, they're like 12 at the time. Like, when I saw that, I was like, I thought it was made up when I first saw that in game, because I was like, that's so, to me personally, I'm like, that feels so unreasonable for for a 12-year-old to both come up with the idea and then still act on it at the same time. It feels, I don't know how else to put it, except for it feels like an insane idea. I love the idea that it was an accident, and then they do frame it as them taking their own life, but not in the way they've done it, where they, drag her outside again and, tie a jumping rope around her neck and that sort of thing, and just leave her like that. Because that feels, to me, I'm just like, that's so ridiculously difficult. How on earth would they get away with that in the first place? And why is that their initial reaction? Like, I can imagine if it was like, she fell down the stairs and died, and then they like moved her like to be next to like the roof of a building outside or something, and then they like forged a suicide note or something. That would, if that happened, I'd be like, I'd 100% buy into that. I'm like, that seems something that would be, I don't like obviously empathize with our logic, that's not something I would ever do, but like I can see the logic and I can follow it and I can buy into that. I can suspend my disbelief enough to buy into it. But just the way it happened with her, with the jump rope, I suppose, on a tree, I just couldn't buy into it. I was just like, this must be fake. This feels totally unreasonable to me, which is like my one criticism of a game. But the thing is, a lot of things hinge on that. Is a problem. Like the entire story, of course, hinges on it in the first place, but a lot of the imagery hinges on the fact that, a hanging, I suppose, because that's like what a lot of the imagery is, like the drooping hair and that sort of thing, the eye, and a lot of things, like I suppose with verticality relating to that. So that's the sort of thing where like it's a thing which I'm willing to buy from a story writing perspective, because of all the imagery which it can evoke, but from a story writing perspective, I'm not willing to buy into the plausibility of it. But from an in-world perspective, I'm just barely able to buy into the plausibility of it, but I'm not willing enough to be like, that should be the execution of it. And actually, so I would have thought, I really kind of wish it was executed a little bit differently. I'm totally fine. Accidental murder, that was actually a fantastic twist, and then them framing it as her taking her own life, but just not maybe necessarily in that way, personally. Because it does feel a lot more tragic, I suppose, in that sense. And I suppose my initial reaction to it was sort of one of being like, almost like anger in a sense, because I feel like it was like, it feels like a lot of it of a game just sort of like swept out underneath my legs, because it sort of like undoes a lot of the storytelling, I suppose, in an aspect, because it's very different from an accidental death to one of suicide. I suppose, like the things which lead up to it, isn't it? So all the like the trauma and the processing that people like Aubrey and Hero have to go through because of this sudden loss and things that they would never understand, I suppose. It suddenly feels like, oh, all of that, like the doormat's been pulled underneath you, pulled out from underneath you. That's not what really happened, which I guess is kind of a point. It's meant to be frustrating. It's meant to be, you meant to see it from their perspective and be like, those friends' perspective and be like, what on earth? And then it's up to you to decide whether you forgive Sunny or not, I suppose. But I feel like from a story writing perspective, like I feel like the story would have been as good if it didn't have that twist in, if it was genuinely she took her own life because of something, and even better if Sunny felt like he caused it, but it's debatable whether he did. They had a big fight, or whether they never got along, where the situation worsened and worsened because of Sunny, or because of both of them, each other, and then she took her own life. Sunny now feels responsible for it, I suppose, in the first place. That would have been perfectly fine, I think, and that would have been a perfectly fine like confession for Sunny had to have at the end, and would still raise the same points of interesting debate. But now it being framed in such like a crazy, I suppose, plot-wise way, I think it took away from it, to be honest. I think it did. I think it ended up not taking away from it from like an overall perspective, but taking up from it because it ends up distracting from like the main sort of story and plot and ideas it's trying to push forward. That's my own personal opinion on it. From an actual sort of like game critique perspective, I think the dream world drags on a little bit more. I would have much rather it inverted, where the real world got more of a focus and the dream world was less so. But I understand that's also a big part of a plot, is because the dream world is meant to be the distraction. It's meant to be, you know, the escape, I suppose, from reality in the first place. The story doesn't make a sense if it's inverted. I just personally like the real world more. Because I found it more interesting and more enticing, I suppose, maybe because of more recurring characters. And the dream world is very much sort of flights of fancy. You don't see much of real world Basil or Mary for development. Just like maybe a couple of flashbacks or something about Mary, just to show a different perspective, to show her difference, I suppose, between real world Mary and dream world Mary, I think would have been cool. But I understand also that's also when you can chalk up to being like, it's escapism. He doesn't want to remember Mary in a bad light. Okay, fair enough. I mean, there's an argument to be made that maybe if so much of it hinges on something where you can't do something because it hinges on the plot, maybe the plot should be like tweaked a little bit to allow for more of better development, I suppose. But you know, that's not up for me to decide. Far from me to say I'm like an expert in like story writing or video game development or anything like that. I don't know. You know, these are again me as a personal consumer's perspective. I will say, yeah, this is probably a lot of the story goes a little bit too far. It pushes at things a bit too far when it doesn't need to necessarily. Like Aubrey being a delinquent is fine. Her walking around and beating up people with a baseball bat and nails is pretty insane, I would say. It's sort of like you can already show her being like a bad person, but you don't need to show her being like that goes like into insanity sort of levels, I would say. It's a bit crazy, and Basil's ending plan is insane to think of and execute, I think. So as I said before in previous points, I think the game could have been like, yeah, I guess it would have benefited if they just toned it back a little bit. But they kept the sadness, they kept the raw feeling, I suppose, of despair and trauma and pain, but they didn't need to execute it in such like over the top way, I would say, because it does take away from it, I think, a little bit. Not a huge amount, but for me personally, I was just sort of like, I would invest into it more, I suppose, if it was pulled back a little bit. I suppose because of the aspect of relatability. I think that's a big thing as well with the ending, is it sort of basically dropped all relatability. Because I'm like, this is so outrageous for like even young me in like a dumb decision. Like, okay, maybe plausibly I would make a dumb decision, certainly if I was younger. But I don't think I would make that like crazy a decision, I suppose, in the first place, which is sort of like, I don't know. I think it's just a personal effect really, where it just, I no longer could like buy into like any sort of like, not relationship, but like relating, I suppose, to the scenario and the characters. So it sort of just made it like feel weird. And yeah, I still think the emotional weight with that is actually higher without the twist. But as I said, that would end up telling kind of a different story, one more about grief and loss rather than one about catharsis and self-acceptance. So it's, you know, depending on the story that was wanting to be told. What else was I going to say about this? But there's something else I wanted to say about this. Like, I think it emotionally hits harder. Just sort of like that sun loss. But yeah, I guess that's a story which has been told multiple times. But, you know, it just, for me personally, I think that's where the emotional like power comes from. Or emotional grief, because it's about the loss of a relationship rather than... I guess the pivot, in my own mind, I built it up about the sort of relationship between all these people being like the main central point, when it feels like it actually was more about Sunny and his own relationship with himself. Actually took like, was the highest priority, not the highest priority, but the highest focal point in the end, which I was just like, I guess it's just my own personal taste where that's not necessarily, that wasn't my favourite story like idea being presented. The ending also, I think, what does this mean? It feels kind of irreparable. Oh yes, because after a reveal where, you know, the reveal is really, really quite a like horrific thing to do. I'm gonna be honest. Like, obviously, if I have like tragic enough of accidental, you know, manslaughter, but that's just sort of like, that is tragic. But it's sort of like, it also becomes like not premeditated, but like a very intentional, I suppose, or with a reveal of like the actions they took. It feels like, huh? And I feel like that pushed basically reveal of Sunny telling his friends in the end from something which is like, oh, do they forgive? Do they not forgive? That's going to be really hard to decide, to something like, okay, this feels almost kind of irreparable for some of them. Like for Hero, I'm like, that seems like inconsolable, like inconceivable, that the relationship is irreparably damaged, I suppose, because of the actions it took. And with Aubrey, probably as well. Kel, maybe not, I would say. Because, you know, and it's fine. That happens when relationships, when like big traumatic things happen, relationships change, sometimes permanently, and it's just a wrong place, wrong time sort of thing. But I feel like it takes away from the interesting sort of like discussion and mystery, which is brought upon by the ending, where it's much more open-ended, where you are free to interpret things how you want. But again, that might just be me believing into my own personal opinions a bit too much about what I think, what I took from it. So that's fair enough. That's why I put a little tag here saying like personally in brackets, because I think that's very, very subjective, even more so than my other opinions. And the final thing is, I feel like the cut captions for the photo album Black Space should be in the game somewhere, because I think it gives a lot more context. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be in the game, but I feel like I learned a lot more from it. Reveals a lot more through the game, like mainly about Mari's attitude and Basil's perspective, which I felt like was sorely missing from the ending point, where I just sort of, like when I first saw it, I was just like, is this just like, are they actually just truly horrible people or something? Like, I got kind of blindsided by the entire thing, which is fine if it's blindsided about the emotional impact, but blindsided about the reasoning and motivation behind it made me feel like very confused rather than like emotionally hurt. So that's the bad things I had to say about the game. Remember, all of that together only makes up a minus 0.5 to me from a perfect game, so it's not that big a deal. But it was enough that it made me at the moment, because it was basically like it was a perfect 10 up until that moment where I was just like, huh? Well, I got really confused, which is why I think in the Let's Play itself, I was very sort of like, I don't know what's going on. This is very strange. But apart from that, the emotional impact is tragic. I love sad stories and bittersweet stories and that sort of thing. And the entire story of being like, seeing what could have been, thinking about what could have been, had this not happened, had things just gone slightly differently, had just a few mistakes not been made, things could have been fine, but they weren't. And there's nothing you can do to change that in the past. You can only move forward and keep going on. And that's why I still think Omori is in my top 20 other games, but I don't think it makes it into my top 5. It's kind of close. And you might be like, that feels unfair to not give it a top 5 place just because of that linchpin of the ending thing. But as I said before, I think a lot of it really does rely on that ending and the actual reveal, the actual truth of what happens. And because it just slightly, like, it didn't miss the mark for me entirely. It still got like a 9 instead of a 10 in archery. But it's sort of just like, that made me feel a bit weird. Maybe an 8 out of 10 or something. if it was like an archery. It just made me go, huh, you know. But it's still a game which made me really think about it, and I still really like buy into these characters and the real world sort of setting, and just taking it from sort of a much more general perspective of the characters and the trauma they went through really is something which I like latch onto story wise. I'm just like, this is fantastic, this is amazingly well executed. So yeah, that's basically most of my thoughts about Omori. I probably missed out a lot of things which I wanted to talk about. Like, its soundtrack is really good as well. It's, you know, yeah, that's it. Like, mechanically it's fine. I would say it's passable. It gets a little bit boring after, I suppose, a while, but it's also kind of interesting at the same time. You know, the emotion system is cool, but I suppose only the bosses really felt like they made me like try something different, I suppose, a lot of the time. But even then, maybe that's just because of the way I play games. But the mechanical points weren't the selling point, I suppose, of this game. It's more about the story and investment you get into the characters and the world. So yeah, would I recommend this game to people? Yeah, I would generally recommend this game. I think you'll know if it's a sort of game that you like or not. If you're not into story and that sort of thing, you're into pure mechanics only, I would not recommend this game to you. But otherwise, if you're just like, you're fine with story or etc. or anything where you're not just like 100% only on mechanics, I would recommend this game to you. It's a good game. It's a very good game, I would say. And the story is one to be invested in. And honestly, it probably resonates with people very differently. Some people probably, you know, love the ending, love that twist, and it works perfectly for them, and it's a perfect game for you. Perfectly fine. Everyone's got different opinions. I just wanted to state my own. It's just a nice starting place of discussion. Feel free to leave your own thoughts about, I suppose, the game in the comments or whatever, you know, things I missed, or, you know, you'd be like, hey, dear darling, I don't agree with you with that, but I understand your perspective, or like, yes, I also thought the same with that. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. But anyway, apart from that, you can enjoy the final episode of that coming out on like March, near the end of March. So I'm going to round this episode off here. So if you have been watching, thank you very much. It's been Animal Crossing New Horizons. I've been here, darling. Likes, comments, subscription, shares are greatly appreciated. Twitter, Discord down below. Hope we see each other again. But for now, it's our farewell. So until next time. Bye-bye for now. I guess I should like end it with like a Omori quote, like, everything will be okay or something. Anyway, yes, me. Whoa.